The Jedi Grandmaster Yoda was one of the wisest and most powerful beings in the galaxy, and with over 8 centuries worth of knowledge in the Jedi arts, he was seen as a shining beacon of the light. The thought that Yoda could turn to the dark side was inconceivable, but in the Legends novel Yoda Dark Rendezvous, we were offered a glimpse into its potential. When he encountered his fallen Padawan Dooku, his attempt to turn Yoda to the dark side to try and defeat Sidious resulted in a terrifying sight. A quick glance was enough to convince Dooku that Yoda would destroy Sidious with his centuries worth of experience and knowledge, and the risk was too high. In his canonical training with the Force Priestesses, Yoda faced a dark side manifestation of himself, and after initially denying its presence, he admitted that the darkness was a part of him. What stopped it from consuming him was his Jedi training, and now he could tame the darkness. But what if Yoda somehow turned to the dark side? What kind of destruction would he inflict on the galaxy? Our story begins in the aftermath of Order 66, and with the Jedi Order in a state of disarray, the survivors are forced into hiding. After witnessing the birth of the Skywalker twins, Yoda, Obi-Wan and Bail Organa split up, and the Grandmaster travelled to Dagobah. The last few days had taken its toll on Yoda, and he felt guilty that the massacre had happened under his leadership. As he sat in his escape pod, Yoda looked forlornly at his empty belt, and though he kept a spare lightsaber, he felt ashamed to wield one in light of his duel with Sidious. During the fight, Yoda realised that the light side had failed to evolve, whilst the dark side had grown, and now he was doubting if the light could ever be victorious again. It was with these heavy thoughts that Yoda guided his escape pod through Dagobah's atmosphere. The Grandmaster used his knowledge from his previous visit to find a suitable landing spot, which was strategically positioned away from the dark side cave, and trudged out of the pod. The initial days of Yoda's exile were slow going, and mainly focused on survival, and he started to construct a small hut from materials in his immediate surroundings. Yoda still couldn't shake off his doubts and the weight of his failures, so he decided to venture into the dark side cave again. The previous vision had shown him the destruction of the Jedi Order and the rise of Sidious, but now he could only see a blurred visage of himself taking down the Sith. This confused Yoda, as his plan with Obi-Wan and Bail Organa was to hide Luke and Leia until they were ready to be trained. On top of the doubts about the light side, he now had doubts about the capability of the Skywalkers if they waited. Yoda's famous patience was being worn out, because he didn't want to make the same mistakes as with Anakin, and the cave was slowly becoming his source of comfort and knowledge. The semi-sentient virgins could sense the growing vulnerabilities in their Grandmaster, and it didn't need a second invitation to corrupt him with the dark side. Whilst Yoda was fighting an internal battle between his teachings and the dark side, his subtle changes were detected by one person on Coruscant. In the repaired and redecorated Imperial Palace, Emperor Palpatine was sat on his throne contemplating about his new apprentice. As he thought about the Jedi who were left, he felt a slight tremor in the Force when he considered Yoda. The little green friend was now a figment of his past victories, but after initially dismissing his threat, Palpatine sensed that he was up to something. The Sith Lord's wrinkled face contorted into a slight frown, and in recognition of the tremor in the Force, he moved Yoda's name slightly higher up Vader's list of targets, then left to further his Sith studies. Sidious largely ignored Yoda for the next days and months, but he should not have underestimated the Grandmaster. The world of Dagobah had been slowly corrupted into darkness before Yoda's arrival, but the Grandmaster's presence in the light provided necessary balance for the cave. Now though, the cave was winning, and the darkness that Yoda had worked to destroy was consuming him. The forest and swamps around him and his hut were becoming aggressive, and the Grandmaster was beginning to relish fighting against the swamp slugs and dragon snakes. The constant visits to the cave were only bringing dark thoughts to his mind, and now he was buried in self-loathing and hate towards Sidious for destroying the Jedi Order. Though his lightsaber remained in his faithful box, Yoda was turning more and more violent, and the creatures were growing fearful of the former Jedi. Dagobah turned into a bloodbath, and when Sidious sensed a shift on Coruscant, he dispatched probe droids and scout troopers to the remote planet. Yoda sensed the chasing Empire from afar, but whilst his previous Jedi self feared being found, the new dark side Yoda saw this as an opportunity to leave the planet. The movement of the creatures alerted him to the precise location of the Sentinel-class shuttle, and the former Jedi moved from tree to tree until he was hidden from view. Scout troopers were now swarming and searching the area, and as the probe droids helped to expand their search radius, Yoda's face stretched into a dangerous grin. The silence of the forest was disturbed by a small rustle of leaves, as Yoda leapt onto a probe droid, and he used the Force to control its direction before turning to the scout troopers. The AT-RTs did not recognize Yoda by face, as the dark side had accelerated his aging, but they were soon alerted to his threat. Yoda leapt onto the top of the closest AT-RT and pulled the unfortunate troopers out of their seats. Yoda maneuvered the walker to turn on the others, and most of the scout troopers were blasted away by the surprise attack. The remainder of the troopers and probe droids scattered across the swamps, but with his authority over the native creatures, the Imperials were soon surrounded. As they raised their blasters for a counterattack, Yoda crushed their weapons, then commanded the creatures to devour them. The sound of the Imperial screams receded into the background, and Yoda calmly walked to his hut to fetch his limited possessions. This was followed by one last trip to the cave, which approved of Yoda's transformation and latest massacre, and Yoda entered into the Sentinel-class shuttle. Before more Imperial scouts arrived, the dark side user left Dagobah and decided that to defeat Palpatine, he would need further knowledge of the dark side and allies. Yoda's first destination was Moraband, a planet he had visited during the Clone Wars, and he would seek the advice of the same ancient Sith Lord again. Though the planet rarely saw any visitors, Yoda was vigilant in case Palpatine was around, and he eventually entered the main Sith temple. The former academy was largely devoid of any artifacts, but Yoda was here for one of the newer exhibits, which was the tomb of Darth Bane. As he had done before, Yoda approached the tomb in front of the giant statue, and the spectre of Bane emerged. When he saw Yoda, the booming voice of Bane turned into a reverberating laugh, and even a Jedi as powerful as Yoda could not resist the dark side. As Yoda was being taunted by Bane, he explained the situation of the galaxy, and Bane laughed more when he heard that Palpatine had successfully completed a revenge against the Jedi. Despite his efforts after Rusam finally coming to fruition, Bane was concerned that the rule of two had ended, and Yoda saw an opportunity to acquire Bane's knowledge. The former Grandmaster told Bane that Palpatine was looking for assassins, instead of real apprentices who were capable of replacing him and continuing the rule of two, and Bane considered it a threat to the future of the Sith. After some more convincing by Yoda, Bane eventually agreed to teach Yoda in the ways of the Sith, and he became a student again. The extensive experience and knowledge of Yoda was both a blessing and a curse, as Yoda found it easy to learn dark side abilities, but his Jedi teachings were a mental obstacle for applying them in real situations. Bane ensured Yoda went through a series of Sith rituals, both to augment Yoda's rapidly deteriorating body, and also to purge him of his Jedi instincts. After several years of brutal training, Yoda was ready according to Bane, and the galaxy was about to change. Just as Palpatine had done during the Clone War, Yoda could now cloud his presence in the Force, either as a light-sided being like Darth Xana had done, or a non-Force sensitive, and he travelled to the planet of Alderaan. When he arrived, a shocked Organa ushered the Jedi into the palace, and thanks to Bane's teachings, Yoda masked his change of appearance, and Organa asked him why he had left his exile. The former Jedi weaved a convincing lie about Palpatine, and how he sensed the Sith Lord was getting closer to finding the Skywalkers, so it was imperative to accelerate their training. Organa was highly reluctant to expose Leia to the galaxy's dangers, and as he had grown attached to Leia, he didn't want her to leave Alderaan. Yoda knew that Organa would not be easy to persuade, and for now, he reached a compromise to begin her training on Alderaan. Leia was chosen instead of Luke because of Obi-Wan's protection of him, but he thought Leia would have made for a Jedi rather than a Sith. This was immediately evident in her early stages of training, as she was as stubborn as Padme had been, so rather than using the training methods taught by Bane, he slowly manipulated Leia into hating her isolation on the Alderaanian palace grounds. Yoda also could sense Leia wanted a life outside of Regency, and she showed an eagerness to fight and become independent from Bail and Breha. The subtle changes in Leia, however, were noticed by the senior Organas, and though they trusted Yoda, they were growing concerned that the war had taken its toll on his mind, and it was negatively affecting Leia. Until this point, Yoda ensured the Organas would not try to contact Obi-Wan, but now they were growing suspicious of his deflections, and the Organas contacted Obi-Wan on Tatooine. The Jedi Master was surprised that Yoda had left Dagobah, as he hadn't sensed anything to suggest deviating from their original plan, and he wondered if Yoda was being influenced by the Sith. Obi-Wan had dismissed his suggestion by Mace Windu at the latter stages of the Clone Wars, but Organa's report was bringing these doubts back to his mind. As the Jedi Master took a brief glance towards the Lars homestead, his face showed that he was reluctant to leave Luke. The expectant Organa was disappointed but understood, and Obi-Wan advised for the Resistance leader to keep a closer eye on Leia and Yoda. Once the transmission ended, Obi-Wan sat on the closest rock and contemplated if he had done the right thing. Though he had been instructed by Yoda to take him to the Lars and hide his own presence from the Empire, Yoda had taken the risk of leaving Dagobah, so why shouldn't he do the same? The first obstacle to training Luke was Owen Lars, who had firmly denied Obi-Wan's attempted visit, and he wanted nothing to do with the Jedi after they had brought nothing but trouble. Obi-Wan almost shivered at the memory of his previous encounter, and he realised the second and toughest obstacle was himself. The Jedi Master was still traumatised from the aftermath of the Clone War, and for the first few years on Tatooine, he was haunted by his failure to prevent Anakin's fall. After hearing of Yoda's move from Dagobah, Obi-Wan was reminded of the dangers of training a Padawan with attachments, and he concluded that he was not ready to train Luke. Whilst Obi-Wan refused to train Luke, Yoda had secretly heard Organa and Obi-Wan's conversation, and he knew that nothing would happen. Yoda felt confident in corrupting Leia and the House of Organa, and having known about the existence of Vader since his days on Dagobah, he planned to lure him to Alderaan. Since the formation of the Galactic Empire, Alderaan had presented an image of loyalty to the Empire thanks to Bail Organa, but it was actually a sanctuary for the growing resistance. Yoda was now a part of these plans, and to maintain his appearance as an ally, he helped to travel to worlds heavily affected by the Empire's slavery and provided support. The Darkside user practiced one of the main principles throughout Bane's training, which was to dominate the weak, and those who sought refuge on Alderaan were now under Yoda's control. Behind the back of the Organas and the Resistance, Yoda began to establish his own network of spies and subordinates, and as he anticipated, Vader was dispatched to investigate the growing disturbance. When the Sith arrived, the Organas were surprised but maintained their calm exterior, and Vader, under strict instructions from Palpatine, asked to search the planet for a Force user. Organa had faith in Yoda hiding himself, but his bigger concern was Leia, and he reluctantly allowed for Vader's search party to scour the planet. Yoda kept track of the towering Sith, and as he helped to mask Leia's presence in the Force, he decided to observe and wait before he confronted him. The efforts of Yoda meant Vader left empty-handed, but the former Grandmaster predicted that the Emperor would be next to turn up if Yoda and his powerful dark side presence didn't leave the planet. Organa was also aware that Yoda's presence was a danger to his people, so he assigned Yoda to become a part of the secret rebel network known as Fulcrum. The Organas were comfortable enough to allow Leia to occasionally leave Alderaan, and Yoda was able to continue Leia's transformation to the dark side. The former Jedi rarely made contact with the other Fulcrum agents, as was a part of his job description, but he felt supremely confident that he could dominate their minds, just as he had done with the others on Alderaan. But like other dark side users, Yoda's overconfidence was soon a problem. Organa not only assigned Yoda to Fulcrum to protect Alderaan, but also for Ahsoka Tano to keep an eye on the Grand Master. The former Padawan had heard about Yoda's changes since the Clone Wars, and she also knew that Leia was being secretly trained. Though Yoda continued to mask his dark side presence, Leia had yet to master this ability, and Yoda still allowed her to sit in on the occasional meetings. It was during one of these mission briefings that a hooded Ahsoka saw Leia, albeit in hologram form, and she could see her eyes flickering. This was initially passed off as a trick in the light, but she soon saw the same sickly yellow eyes as other dark side users such as Maul. Once the briefing was over, Fulcrum sought out Bail Organa, and the politician's worst fears had been realised. After his previous failure to bring Obi-Wan out of Tatooine, Bail ordered Ahsoka to find the Jedi Master, in the hopes of saving Leia and Yoda. The former Padawan recognised the significance of the mission, and delegated her own Fulcrum mission to another agent, then set off to Tatooine. Obi-Wan hadn't given a precise location of his residence to even Organa, only that he resided in an area where he could watch over Luke, as they had been wary of Imperial interception, so she relied on her previous visit to Tatooine and the Force. Her old master Anakin had refused to share much of his troubled childhood, but from what Obi-Wan had told her, he was enslaved by the Hutts on the planet. Another clue that she had was the name Lars, which was a name that Anakin had used in their mission to Zygeria, which he hoped would help track down any surviving ancestors living with Luke, and therefore near Obi-Wan. After boarding a commercial star cruiser to the capital city of Bestine, the former Jedi went to the property bureau, and there she found a list of available properties, but more importantly, a list of occupied properties with their residents. After a well-executed mind trick on the agent, Ahsoka found the name Lars, and she hired a land speeder to travel to the homestead, which was located in the Jundland Waste. Though not aware of the tension between Lars and Obi-Wan, she opted against further human contact, and instead relied on the data she had obtained from the Bureau. After ruling out the surrounding moisture farms, she then made a list of potential candidates and travelled to most of them, until she saw one on her list owned by Mr. Ben. Ahsoka knew she had found the correct location, and as she decelerated her land speeder to the entrance, she saw the Jedi Master calmly meditating outside. If not for the gravity of the situation, she would have shown her relief that the Jedi Master was still alive. The Jedi Master slowly opened his eyes and turned to his old friend and told her that she was far from safety. A brief silence punctured the cooling air, until the younger of the Force users pulled out a portable holocommunicator and asked Obi-Wan to look carefully at Leia. The Jedi only glanced at the hologram from the corner of his eye, then looked to the ground, as he acknowledged that he should have listened to Bail Organa, and another Skywalker had been lost. Despite these thoughts, Obi-Wan's Jedi instincts kicked in, and with one glance at the last homestead in the fading light, he realised it was time for him to help the galaxy again. After retrieving his and his old Padawan's lightsabers from their burial spot, Obi-Wan resisted the urge to go to the last home and face Owen's fury, and the Clone Wars veterans headed to Mos Eisley to leave the planet. On the way there, they discussed a brief plan with Bail Organa to try and lure Yoda to a suitable location, and also to try and separate Leia from her wayward master. Obi-Wan's unique and risky idea was to use light side vergences to try and redeem them, but Organa's intelligence suggested that they were all occupied by the Empire. The Jedi Master now remembered Yoda's words about the dark side, and if the darkness had consumed Yoda, then the mere vergence would be insufficient to contain him, and it now controlled his destiny. Leia could still be saved though, so Organa decided he would send Yoda to Coruscant to try and keep an eye on the Emperor's movements. This was an even greater risk than Obi-Wan's plan, but they felt a guaranteed separation between Yoda and Leia. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka left Tatooine in a commercial cruiser, and as they expected, Yoda left Leia behind for this delicate mission, as he was confident that she had been totally corrupted. Leia was kept on Alderaan, and when the two Order 66 survivors returned to the planet, they disguised themselves to observe her. After several days of observing Leia's behaviour, Obi-Wan and Ahsoka sensed the conflict within Leia, as it seemed returning to the Organas and being away from Yoda began to help her. Yoda's recent training was brutal and intense, however the stubbornness she inherited from Padme was stronger than Yoda thought, and the still disguised Obi-Wan and Ahsoka started to teach her the ways of the Jedi. As the dark side presence on Alderaan was starting to fade, Yoda was not following Organa's orders to go to Coruscant, as he was instead heading for Tatooine. Yoda knew all about Organa's plans for Leia, and in truth, she was not suitable for a Sith. After Organa's first failed attempt to recruit Obi-Wan, Yoda knew it would take something more substantial to get Obi-Wan away from Luke, and the appointment of Fulcrum was perfect. Even though she was well disguised, Yoda knew the leader of the small network was Ahsoka Tano, and he instigated the transmission between her and Leia, in the hopes of getting a reaction. Now he was on his way to an unguarded Luke, and after he took a similar route to Ahsoka, he was faced with the sight of the last home. Unlike his former Clone Wars counterparts, Yoda had no hesitancy in approaching the Lars, but he decided for a more violent greeting. The dark side users saw Luke tending to evaporate outside of the home, so Yoda diverted his focus to a small fire in the centre of the settlement. Yoda then used his pyrokinetic abilities to spread the fire, and as the moisture farmers were screaming in and on the edge of their homes, he enhanced the intensity of the attack on the Lars home. Yoda let out a cackle that sounded alien to anyone who knew him as a Jedi, and when the fire started to diminish, he found a distraught Luke. The farm boy saw Yoda walking slowly with his cane, and in light of the massacre he had just witnessed, Yoda was his saviour. Yoda took inspiration from Palpatine in portraying himself as a vulnerable and old being, and he took Luke away from the moisture farms and out of Tatooine. Once they were aboard Yoda's ship, the inquisitive and vengeful Luke asked Yoda about the attack and who could have caused it. Yoda saw a chance to manipulate and bring forward the darkness within Luke, and told him that it was actually Ben Kenobi, who became a legend in his brief stay on Tatooine. Luke was not aware that Obi-Wan left Tatooine for Alderaan, so he somewhat bore the lie about him, and his impatience for revenge was clear for Yoda to see. The near 900-year-old face hid a smirk of contentment, and he identified that this Skywalker would make for a better dark side student. Yoda wanted to learn from the mistakes made during Leia's training, so rather than attempting to slowly expose Luke to the dark side, he aimed to expose his latest wound by returning to his old home on Dagobah. Yoda now had little regard for his own anonymity, and he and his new and slightly confused apprentice travelled to the dark side cave. Since Yoda's previous visit, the cave's influence rapidly spread through the planet like a plague, and Luke in particular was overwhelmed by the dark side nexus. What they did not expect, however, was the presence of the Empire, and Yoda was fortunate to land outside of the radius of the newly constructed Imperial outpost. Though there were more troopers than the previous scouting team, Yoda did not see them as a threat to their lives, and he took Luke to the dark side cave, which was even further from the base. The creatures around the swamps remembered Yoda, and the cave welcomed the newest addition, who was Luke. As the young Skywalker had entered the cave, Yoda sensed imminent danger, and he looked overhead, to see a menacing looking starfighter tailed by 2 Imperial TIE fighters flying towards the base. Yoda knew that the lead starfighter was piloted by Darth Vader, and after his examination of him on Alderaan, he was now prepared to face him. Though he wanted Luke to emerge before the confrontation, this plan was interrupted by the imposing Sith, who asked for the security of their base to be increased. The base commander hid his confusion, as the only visible threats were the creatures, but Vader knew otherwise. The Sith sensed the strong presence of the dark side on the planet, just as his master had known, and he piloted his customized speeder towards its source. Any creatures were brushed aside by a flash of his crimson red lightsaber, but as he approached the cave, he was thrown off into a tree. Vader's life support systems on his suit were flashing and beeping, and these sounds overwhelmed a noticeable crackle from above him. A perched Yoda sensed Vader's arrival, and only required a mere fraction of his power to destabilize the Sith, who had failed to sense the danger in time. Yoda now saw Vader recovering from the attack, and his breathing sounded heavy and laboured. The Sith's helmet rotated as he scanned his surroundings, and the hidden Yoda took control of the swamp to attack Vader. The Sith used the pain from the first attack to fuel his own, and in a flurry of force pushes and pulls, Vader ripped open the entire area. Yoda avoided all of this by climbing to the top of the cave, and he decided he had enough of Vader's show, so he summoned Sith lining from his fingertips onto Vader's suit. Vader moved to block the attack with his blade, but as Yoda revelled in the dark side power, it exposed the Sith's earlier injuries. The little green dark side user hopped to the swamp floor with sadistic glee, and before the scout troopers arrived to collect Vader, he used a dark side version of a mind trick, so Vader would have something to take back to his master. Yoda retreated to the trees again, and after the Imperials collected Vader, they scanned the area for any sign of danger, but Yoda cloaked his presence again. A short while later, Luke emerged from the cave looking visibly shaken, and when Yoda asked what he had seen, Luke saw a blur of blue lightsabers. Yoda was mindful of how the vision could be interpreted, and he began his training of Luke on Dagobah. Whilst Yoda was having the success in his training of Luke, the other twin was also being trained, but with lesser success. The time away from Yoda allowed Leia to be purged of the darkness, but after Obi-Wan and Ahsoka revealed their real identities, there was a bigger problem. Not only had Leia rejected the dark side, but it was clear that she preferred the path of politics like Padme, so her training was changed. Leia's training combined her senatorial studies with the Force, and Obi-Wan and Ahsoka's initial doubts about this path were quickly eradicated. Leia's leadership qualities and ability to sense the thoughts and emotions of others now proved priceless to the growing resistance, as she helped to recruit allies and spot potential Imperial defectors. The Clone War which had been won outside of the battlefield was threatening to repeat itself, only this time on the side of the light. Though the Imperial Senate held little power, Leia made notes on all of the leaders of the world, and those who had also masked their true allegiances were able to change sides. Palpatine had ironically underestimated the Senate, but his mind was soon shifted to news from Dagobah. The Sith Lord sensed his apprentice in danger from across the galaxy, and the report from the base commander was equally concerning. Vader's injuries pointed to some kind of electrical attack, but the scanning of Dagobah hadn't shown any kind of civilization or technology. The Emperor stood up from his throne, and he decided that he had seen enough, and it was time for him to reconsider the threat of Dagobah. Palpatine first ordered the base commander to keep Vader in his current injured state, then to dispatch a fleet over the Dagobah planet and its moons. Before the base commander could question the orders, as his scouts had found nothing, Palpatine ordered for his Lambda-class shuttle to be prepared for takeoff. Back on Alderaan, the news of Luke's abduction had finally reached the ears of the Resistance chain of command, because the Tatooine authorities only noticed when they went to collect Jabba's water tax. Obi-Wan, Ahsoka and the Organas knew that Yoda was responsible, and it now dawned on them that both Yoda had truly fallen to the dark side, and Palpatine might not be the biggest threat in the galaxy. Now they were faced with the tough task of locating the Jedi Grand Master, and despite their limited resources, Organa spread his scouts across the galaxy. Palpatine had the opposite problem, as he approached Dagobah after several days of travelling, and that was unwrapping the mystery of Dagobah. The Sith Lord moved his ship to the main docking bay in the Imperial I-class Star Destroyer, and with his royal guards around him, he went to the bridge to find out what exactly had happened to Vader. A group of nervous-looking officers bowed to their leader, and they visibly feared for their lives, as they gave a report of what they had found on the surface. Palpatine frowned when he saw the rather barren and scarce fragments of intel, but it was not deceit on the part of his officers. No, this was something far beyond the capabilities of mere Imperial officers, and worthy of his personal inspection. Palpatine dismissed his royal guard for the short journey, and upon reaching the surface, he asked to be guided to the location of his apprentice. Vader was in one of the medical bays of the Imperial base, and when Palpatine walked in, he saw that he was being kept alive through a bacta tank. Vader sensed the arrival of his master, and his eyes flickered open. Palpatine looked at his apprentice with such intensity, it was as if he was forging a hole into his soul, and without regard for the equipment around them, he unleashed a furious lightning attack. Any surrounding medical droids were exterminated, and officers outside grew concerned about the integrity of the building, but Palpatine continued to stare at Vader. The apprentice tumbled to the ground in pain, and Palpatine walked towards the exit, but stopped to swivel his head and ordered his apprentice to repair himself. The Sith Lord strode purposely away from the base, and as the disgruntled officers repaired his damage, he felt the dark side versions growing closer. After Vader had attempted to use a speeder bike, Palpatine decided to take the journey slowly, and he sensed the creatures were all affected by the dark side. As he approached the clearing which was caused by Vader, he now felt the familiar presence in the Force of an old enemy. Palpatine smiled and called for Master Yoda to fight him. The Sith expected to see a frail green Jedi, exactly as he had left him after their duel in the Senate arena, but instead, he was greeted by a creature immersed in the dark side. The eyes of the Sith briefly flickered in fear, but then turned into delight. Yoda was mocked for his transformation, and Palpatine told him that it was a concession that Yoda had been wrong, and the dark side was superior. Palpatine ignited his lightsaber, which had rarely seen uses other than the occasional spar with Vader, but Yoda did not. A red flash surged towards Yoda, but with supreme calmness, Yoda deflected Palpatine's blade to the side with the Force. The Emperor was surprised again, and now he realised why Vader had been beaten so easily. Sidious would not make the same mistake and underestimate this new Yoda, and he gathered some of the fallen trees in the air to throw at Yoda. The former Jedi reflected these projectiles with a shimmering shield of lightning, and diverted them back towards Sidious, who was growing with anger after each passing moment. The Emperor now dipped into the risky ability of Force Rage, which in bursts could enhance his user's abilities and physique in combat, and almost everyone would have been decimated by such an attack. This iteration of Yoda was an exception though, and he used his knowledge of Sith sorcery, which he had acquired in his time as a Jedi but not used, in order to conjure damaging tendrils around him. Sidious tried to blitz through these to get to Yoda, but after several failed attempts, Sidious realised that these tendrils were making him weaker, and he was forced to stop his Force Rage. The Sith Lord changed his strategy, and he drew upon his knowledge of Sith magic to conjure up an illusion, and this was so realistic that Yoda considered it as an equal threat. Yoda's spare lightsaber flew from its hidden box, but instead of wielding it, he let it hover around him and deflect any oncoming attacks, whilst he sat in a meditative pose. As Sidious's furious attacks were being blocked, Yoda rejuvenated himself and repaired his tired and fragile body, then focused on his surroundings. As his lightsaber distracts Sidious, Yoda drew upon the dark side entities corrupted by the nearby cave, and like thousands of small bolts, they fired into Palpatine. The Sith Lord was forced to deflect these sentient missiles, and Yoda saw his moment to join the creatures and attacked. Yoda's face showed he was feral and hungry, and he pummeled at Palpatine's body with Force-enhanced attacks, as he fueled each one with revenge from their previous duel. Palpatine instinctively threw up his hands to cast a lightning attack, but Yoda utilised Tutaminis to reflect the attack onto Palpatine, until the Sith's face caved in and his body imploded on itself. A tired Yoda hobbled back to his hut to rest and find Luke, but his desire for rest was cut short by the Imperial fleet from above. The fall of Palpatine triggered an immediate action from the fleet, and all of the complement of troopers and vehicles from the Imperial Star Destroyer ignited into action. Luke was forced to carry Yoda in his arms, and their destination was the cave again. As Yoda aimed to heal himself with the help of the dark side, the skies above Dagobah were full of activity, the likes of which the system had never seen. The combination of the Imperial fleet and the demise of Palpatine had alerted those on Alderaan, and a team was organised to scout the planet. As most of the Imperial troopers had gone to search Dagobah, the Resistance movement wasted no time in launching an attack, both to forge a path for themselves to go to the planet, and also to draw the Imperials out from the surface. Palpatine had been overly confident that his visit would be short, and now the Empire paid the price. The Fleet Admiral called desperately for reinforcements, but he knew that they would be too late. Obi-Wan led the squadron of Y-Wings and X-Wings to the surface, and he also received guidance from his old master. Obi-Wan had begun to sense the presence of Qui-Gon during his time on Alderaan, and now he told Obi-Wan to look beyond the familiarity surrounding Vader. The Jedi had already heard that his old apprentice was not in the best condition, but Qui-Gon's advice convinced him that Ahsoka and her team would capture the Imperial base, whilst his destiny lay elsewhere. Obi-Wan told the others of his plan and landed his starfighter away from the Imperial base. Then he started to search his surroundings with the Force. The dark side was almost overwhelming for the Jedi Master, but Obi-Wan pushed forwards and followed a distinct trail. At the sight of a small column of smoke, Obi-Wan reached for his lightsaber and ventured towards its source, and there he found Luke and an ailing Yoda. Obi-Wan remained cautious, as Luke raised Yoda's lightsaber and stood to protect him, and with the dark side fueling him, he lunged at his former friend. Obi-Wan was initially taken aback by Luke's attacks, but also some of his taunts, which accused him of abandoning him on Tatooine. The Jedi Master had heard such deceit before, and he knew it was useless to tell Luke the truth, as he was already submerged in the dark side. As the young Luke fought the Jedi Master, Obi-Wan was only trying to block the attacks, as he was waiting for a response from Yoda. The de facto Sith Lord's body was wilting under the dark side, but he still found the energy to provide his apprentice with further strength. Luke now pushed Obi-Wan towards the cave, but as he was about to gain the upper hand, a blue lightsaber cut off Luke's lower legs. As Luke fell to the floor, Leia stood behind him with Anakin's lightsaber, and behind her, Yoda let out a final roar. The days following the Battle of Dagobah were filled with controversy and contrasting reports, as the Empire tried to cover their fall of their leaders. Leia combined a political task with those of reigniting the Jedi Order, and Yoda's fall served as a warning that even the most powerful were not immune to the dark side.